Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Christian Reeve podcast. Today's guest is the founder and CEO of Sinister Cinema, hailing all the way from Medford in Oregon in the United States. His name is Greg Luce. Welcome to the program. How you doing?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to finally have you here. For those, well, you guys on the watching, listening to this won't know, but we had about half an hour of technical difficulties. It was my fault. So yeah.
Miracles of computers.
I've been doing this show for nearly 3 years, and it was just something painful of like not having the right microphone set up. I just feel so embarrassed. But anyway, um, I want to get straight into talking to you because I've
Sure.
been not been able to talk to you for ages. So, talk us through the creation of Sinister Cinema and your passion for movies.
Well, first of all, how much time do we have?
As long as you want. I'm.
Uh, well, I'll give you not the long story, but the medium long story or the medium story. Um, I was a kid. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and for some reason, I just had this attraction to old black and white movies. Not just horror films, but just old black and white movies in general. I loved them. Every day I'd get home from school and I'm 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, and you could catch the 4:30 movie from Spokane, Washington, Channel 6, I think it was. And it was always old black and white stuff. And, so when I was a kid, I started watching all these old movies. And somewhere along the way, I was downtown one day somewhere in Walla Walla or Pendleton, which are the towns where I grew up. And I saw this magazine on the newsstand called Horror Monsters, which was a Charlton publication. And then later on, I saw one called Famous Monsters of Filmland, which was Forrest J. Ackerman's magazine that was around for decades. May he rest in peace. Forrest was a great man. But I bought copies of those and I started getting interested in all this old horror stuff. And so when I was a kid, I used to, you'd scan the TV guide to see when Frankenstein meets the Wolfman was going to show or whatever mummy movie or, and some channels had more of this kind of stuff than other channels. So as I grew up, I got into radio and television after I went through college, got my communications degree. And along the way, I was a screaming top 40 disc jockey at KMEL in San Francisco, and we're interviewing Duran and Debbie Gibson and all these people, And a guy calls me one day out of the blue from this little cable access station down in San Jose. It was called the Classic Movie Channel, and it could only be seen in the Bay Area, and you had to have cable. But they wanted me to host a horror movie show, a weekend horror movie show, just like Zachary or some of these other famous, Bob Wilkins, my hero. These horror hosts here in America had long established, well-known TV shows in their regions, And so I started a Sinister Cinema TV show. And I hosted it. We shot it at the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, which is an incredible place. It's not necessarily spooky, but it is a fascinating place. And we would shoot from a different room from the Winchester Mystery House for every show. And I'd go down, I lived in the up towards San Francisco. I was in Pacifica. And I'd go down once a month and we'd shoot 4 or 5 shows. And I'd have guests in. I'd have everybody from Greg Kihn, the rock and roll star, to William K. Everson, the film historian. And this went on for several years. But what I got out of this deal, I never got paid a dime for doing this, but what I got was access to their film library, which was a huge public domain film library. So they allowed me to take video masters home and create my own dubbing masters for my fledgling little company, Sinister Cinema. And the way that got started was I was complaining one day to a guy by the name of Kit Parker. And Kit has a film rental library. He's still around after all these years. And I was complaining to him one time about the cost of VHS tapes, which were like $25 back then, and communicating and trading long distance with all these collectors from New York and all this. And he goes, well, why don't you sell some of this stuff? Right. So I said, well, how? I mean, I can't do that, you know. And he goes, you know, a lot that you like so much, these old Poverty Row studios, they're long gone. The films, the copyrights have expired. They're in the public domain. So if you can get copies of them, you can sell them legally all you want. So that's what I did. It was basically a side business to pay for the cost of my movie addiction. But then it got a little bigger and a little bigger and a little bigger. And finally, one day, I realized it was big enough that I could get out of radio if I wanted. And I did. And that was 39 years ago. Sinister, we started very small, like 3 VHS machines dubbing connected to each other and one beta machine, you know. And we started buying film. We got our own equipment. I still have an old RCA TK29 camera, which weighs a ton, sitting in my film room downstairs. And, you know, here I am in 2023 now, and still, I'm going to be 70 years old next month, and I'm still doing it.
Congratulations. Yeah, lots to unpack there. But I think that the biggest thing that
Yeah,
like, stood out to me straight away, and I noticed this when I went on your website and I did a bit of research and such, is obviously where you mentioned that the copyright aspect. And I was thinking to myself, because I know that you spend a lot of time doing restoration and there's various different ways that you do that. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But you've got this library of films.
yes.
And as you said, for many of them, the copyright has expired. Walk us through like how that works from a business perspective, because typically, like, I'll give a modern example for people who might not be as familiar with what we're kind of going into now. So, the copyright on Mickey Mouse is about to come up,
That's
um,
correct.
and we're talking specifically the original drawings or artwork
Steamboat
for,
Willie. That's
yeah.
right.
So that will then go into the public domain, and basically anyone will be able to use that likeness. And famously, especially in places like the United States, you were not allowed to even have like a mouse type mascot deal. Let's say like you run like a local restaurant and you have like a mouse like
I
character or something.
I know. Yeah, it
Right.
was Disney was one of the ones that protected their intellectual properties to the extreme sometimes, going into
100%.
daycare centers and things like that, you know. But the fact of the matter is, on January 1st of this coming year, uh, Steamboat Willie will fall into the public domain. Now, the image of Mickey Mouse, as I understand the law, and I'm not an attorney, but I like to think I know as much about copyright law as it pertains to films and books from this era is as good as just about any copyright attorney. I really I feel like I know my stuff fairly well. That's not to say I'm an expert, but I know my stuff. And so the image of Mickey Mouse in Steamboat Willie, as I understand the law, will be free and clear. However, you must remember that in 1940 or 41 or whatever it was, they came out with Fantasia. And that had a whole new aspect of Mickey Mouse. Instead of button eyes, he had human eyes. That image of Mickey Mouse will still be protected for another, what, 12 years or whatever it is.
Mm.
So, yeah. So in 12 years, when the stuff from 1940 or 41 is falling into the public domain, then we will be free and clear to use that image as well.
Yeah, and
So,
it kind of just fascinates me about this ability to, I suppose, buy and sell and use something. I mean, I suppose the best example of this is probably classical music, and how, you know, you can be an artist and record, let's say, a bunch of Chopin songs and do your own interpretations, and you can sell that record and make money on that, and
right.
you don't have to kind of pay copyright to anyone. But equally,
No,
you and maybe 50 other artists could do the same thing. And I guess that bringing that back to yourself, I mean, there's not going to be loads and loads of people doing sort of the work you do of restoration and stuff like that, because that takes a long time, a lot of dedication, and it's a whole thing unto itself. You know what I mean? But I guess I just wanted to kind of break down a little bit like the business side of things as far as
yeah.
it
So
pertains to that.
anything, Christian, anything that's in the public domain, is free and clear to use. Now, it's very complicated. You and I could sit here for the next 2 hours and talk about copyright law, and you're going to bore your listeners to tears because it is truly complicated. You have things like the Uruguay Round Agreements Act and the GATT Accord, which was part of the GATT Accord, which restored copyrights in international works and things like that, and how that affected me, and all the changes in American law, the automatic renewal law, and all these other things that you just could go on and on and on.
Okay.
I'll give you a quick example. I don't know if you're aware of this, but everything prior to 1978, and even before I believe it's 88, to a certain degree, if you published your work in this country without a proper notice of copyright, somewhere, like if it was a book in the opening or closing pages, or if it was a movie somewhere in the opening or closing credits, and you published it without that notice, your work fell into the public domain. That's what
Wow.
happened. Yeah, that's what happened to Night of the Living Dead and George Lucas. The original Night of the Living Dead is in the public domain here in the United States. Now, I can't say that that's true necessarily in every country in the world, because every country is a little different.
Yeah.
And some countries go by what's called the rule of the shorter term, and I won't even get into that. But go ahead.
Well, I'll add to that. Is that basically like whoever started theirs first, their company first? Because I think the WWF did that originally, didn't they?
I'm
So
not sure if I understand the question.
okay, so in the UK, that there's a company called the World Wildlife Fund, a charity
Okay.
organization for
Hmm.
wildlife, and they've been around. Uh, I wouldn't put a guess on it, but I would say probably at least the last 40, 50 years, maybe
Okay.
something like that. Anyway, and then there's the World Wrestling Federation, now
Right.
WWE, in the United States, which I believe formed somewhere around the early 80s, because it used to be the WWF and then they changed it, shortened it to WWF. Anyway, the thing that fascinated me about that was that, roughly speaking, they set up their companies within a few years of each other, like give or take, right?
Yes.
Um, but they're completely different industries, completely different
Right.
fields, etc. But then the UK company, the WWF, sued the American company, and they won. And
Well, you see,
so
you're
that's
talking. We're talking about. This is a little different than copyright.
okay.
We're talking about trademarks or business name laws.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Uh,
yeah. Sorry, I meant like when you talked about the rule of shorter term, I thought you meant like whoever holds it for the shorter amount of time loses or something like that.
no, some companies subscribe to. It's a in copyright laws in many countries, they look at, even if something would be normally protected. For instance, here in the United States, um, we have a set of laws, and in Great Britain they have a set of laws
Right. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
are different.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so some countries that follow the rule of the shorter term, even though, let's take some work that has fallen into the public domain in the United States because of the natural course of copyright law, correct? Okay. In Great Britain, though, if you applied British law to that work that's in the public domain in the United States, it might still be protected in Great Britain. However, possibly Great Britain, and I can't remember off the top of my head, goes by the rule of the shorter term, which
Right.
says if it's public domain in its country of origin, then we recognize it as public domain as well. Okay. And
Okay.
and that's what the rule of the shorter term is. And I believe most of the European Union follows the rule of the shorter term. So even though some film here might be still copyrighted, if you look at it strictly under British law, um, because it's public domain over here, the copyright is not recognized in Great Britain. And I'm pretty sure that you guys are under the rule of the shorter term, because I see PD American stuff on Amazon UK all the time. So that's how that works.
I want to move it to talking about streaming for a little bit, because one thing I noticed on your website is that you're selling physical media, which I think
Yeah,
there's always going to be a market for that. And it's an interesting kind of place that we're in when it comes to film now, because obviously for modern film, everything is available on streaming services eventually. You can obviously go to the cinema and see new movies and classic movies, but generally
sure.
speaking, the main way that people are consuming film and TV is on streaming services now. You can still get well, I don't know if you can still get DVDs, but you can definitely get Blu-ray. Uh, anyway, one thing that I wanted to say right off the bat is that what you're doing and other people similar to you are doing is kind of like a valuable service, really, because it's not only restoration, but it's making this content available that wouldn't otherwise be available in
That's
general
correct.
to consume. But obviously,
Yeah.
the next logical step is then to make it available via streaming. Is that something you're looking to do? And also, kind
Well,
of, what are your
that,
thoughts on
that's a
streaming
very
as
good
well?
question. We actually have, we don't stream off of our website, but we have right now about 800 titles, approximately, give or take 50 or 100, that are available for instant video on
Ah,
Amazon.com. Okay. And I have found that, okay, the process of us setting up streaming off the Sinister Cinema website is a little complicated, and I'll be the first one to admit, Christian, I'm a little behind the times on the whole streaming thing. Okay. However, we are working with a new company right now called Allied Vaughn, and we have just launched or are launching about 10 of our more recent titles into their streaming service, their instant video service. And we intend over the next couple of years to put on as many titles as we can. Uh, oh, there goes one of them right now. uh, um, we're going to make them available for instant video, in addition to being available as you have disc on demand or media
yeah.
on demand and instant video. And so we're going to try to get that going with our new company, Allied Vaughn. But in the meantime, there are like about 800 titles. And if you go on Amazon and you just search Sinister Cinema under movies and TV, all these titles will pop up. There's pages of them, some of our older stuff, but we are trying to really upgrade a lot of older stuff.
Mm.
And I'm doing all of our upgraded stuff comes obviously through us on our own website, www.sinistercinema.com, but we're trying to make as much of it available as quickly as we can through Allied Vaughn. And Allied Vaughn reaches everywhere. They put our stuff on Amazon as well. Moviezing, oldies.com, Walmart, Barnes and Noble, all these various websites are carrying our product now through Allied Vaughn. They're great people. I just love my affiliation with them.
I feel like a big thing here is that like it's not just about making the movies available. It's also about preserving history. I feel like is a big part of this. And something about watching old movies just feels different. Like a good example that comes to mind for me, or a few, would be, for instance, Nosferatu or The Wizard of Oz. And
Yeah.
especially with The Wizard of Oz, because as I understand, that was the first, I might be wrong on this, but the first like feature film to feature like Technicolor,
Well, it was
something like
one
that.
of the early ones. It wasn't the
Right.
first. I believe it was Becky Sharp.
Okay.
Uh, but it was one of the first. And you're so right. Um, you see, and I've probably said this in just about every interview I've ever done, but I'll tell it to you too. Sinister Cinema is like a hobby run amok. Because I'm a real aficionado of these old films,
Yeah.
not just horror films, things that we don't sell. I'm sitting, watching Betty Davis or Errol Flynn just about every night. There is, and what we do here at Sinister is we help, and I'll be honest, it's largely baby boomers at this point, and we'd
Right.
like to branch out, but we help people find their memories,
Okay.
find those special things that they grew up with when they were a kid. and rekindle the interest in that type of film. And then suddenly, all these films they watched when they were a kid, well, yeah, they're seeing those again, and not just from us, but from other companies as well. However, they're also rediscovering or discovering for the first time films that they never saw when they were a kid, but are in that same time period from some of the same
Yeah.
genres that they cherish so much. So it opens up a whole new broad vista of films like, hey, I never got to see this when I was a kid, but boy, I can sure see it now. I know what you mean. And I'll tell you one other thing, Christian. Sometimes, and a lot of them, bless their hearts, are gone now. But we used to get these old movie stars calling us saying, hey, you got a movie I was in, and I haven't seen it since I made it. Mark Forrest, who's in a lot of these sword and sandal films, he used to call us all the time. And he was in all these Hercules and Goliath films. He was a Brooklyn boy, and he was a weightlifter, and they brought him over to Italy to make all these movies. Well, he would call us and say, "Hey, you've got this one or that one, you Goliath or Hercules, versus whoever, and we'd send him copies, and they would, they talk to us, and we helped them find some of the missing pieces of their past, so to speak. So it's been a lot of fun, and you know, I'm not a poor man, I'm not a rich man, I'm somewhere in the middle. But Sinister Cinema has really been a a guilty pleasure. But I've made a living, but I like to think that I've really reached out to a lot of people, and it's made a difference in people's lives.
100%. Again, so much to unpack now. I quickly want to say, like, there's something to be said for watching a movie from its time, because a lot of the time you do see, series come out that are based in or set in a certain period, but it's not the same as like it actually being filmed in that time. Like a recent example is I watched some of which was it, the Fast and Furious movies for the first time. I'd never seen them. And of course, the first few are set in the early 2000s, like they were
Right.
filmed then.
Yeah.
So all of the fashion, the music, just
Oh,
everything is of that time. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, I remember when people dressed that way. I remember that. This is weird, and it hits you with that nostalgia that
yeah.
modern film can't necessarily do when it's trying to kind of give you, a sneak peek of what it used to be like. Like it. You can get faithful representations. Don't get me wrong. Like I think Stranger Things, for instance, the series does a good job of trying to capture the essence of the '80s, but it'll never quite be the same as watching like The Breakfast Club or something, and
I was going to
just
say, my wife and I just in the last year or so, we popped in 16 candles. And
great movie.
and oh my gosh, it was like stepping back into the 1980s again, you know. And we don't realize it at the time. We're going through life and going through time, but we're dating ourselves all the time. We things change subtly over periods of time so that, what seemed to be totally normal 30 years ago, we go back and take a snapshot of it and look at it through a movie or through old pictures, and you go, oh wow,
I
things are
had
so
that.
different back then. It's
I
a
had that the other
blast from the
day.
past.
I had that the other day. Like, I was looking through some old university pictures from 7 or 8 years ago, and I looked in the picture of one of my dorm rooms, and sitting on the desk is like an iPod
Yeah,
and the speaker, and I'm like, I don't need, like, I think I've got it somewhere, but I haven't used it in well over 10 years because you don't need to now. But yeah,
I
you're
know.
right. It's
I
it's
know.
just mad how that like passes by and it just changes, and you're like, whoa.
Time flies. I'll tell you, it really does.
Oh
But
man.
I've been doing this now for 39 years. I've been, like I said, I'm going to be 70 next month, and I've been doing it over half my life. What happened to Sonny Joe Fox, the top 40 disc jockey from KMEL from 35 years ago? Oh my gosh. So yeah, time it sweeps by. I've had my kids are all grown, and but I'm out here still dubbing those DVDs.
Has there been anything kind of surprising throughout the process of doing that? Something that maybe caught you off guard, or maybe something just I don't know, like a memorable moment while you were restoring movies or going back that you just sort of encountered?
Well, I haven't mentioned armchair fiction yet because we do
Okay.
two things here. Not only do we sell old movies, but here, I'll show you. We sell old books. These
There
are
you
print,
go.
these are print on demand editions of books. I don't know if you can see them that well.
Brilliant. Look at that.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
and we put these together ourselves. And I put the covers together. We scan them, we proofread them. And again, we're always searching for public domain stuff. Although we do sell some copyrighted things from famous authors like Robert Silverberg or
Hmm.
George Zabrowski. Um, and so about 13 years ago, I had always wanted to do with books what I had been doing since 1984 with video and movies. You know, Greg, learn to turn off your phone during an interview.
Rookie 101 mistake. Now we're even.
Yeah. So, you know, I'd be fired if I was a DJ and allowed that to
Nah,
happen.
you're fine. You're
So
fine.
anyway, but anyway, and then I learned, and had actually been around for a few years when I learned about it. But there was this program through Amazon.com called CreateSpace, and it was a print on demand service.
Mm.
And I discovered that, you see, in the past, I knew that there was tons and tons of old fiction that, again, had fallen out of copyright, but the cost of printing them and doing all that stuff was just enormous. And you'd have to get your print cost down, you'd have to print huge, a huge volume of each book and have a warehouse and all this stuff. And, I'm a little guy. I'm a mom and pop. I'm the king of the mom and poppers, I like to think. But CreateSpace, this program through Amazon, I found out you can order at reasonable prices. You can upload your books. You sign up, you become a member, and you can upload books, and you can order ones and twosies at the same price to you for printing that it would normally have cost you to print, 1,000 books, to get the kind of price that you want. You would have to order 1,000 or 2,000 books or whatever. Now you only have to order one. And not only that, but Amazon lists your product on Amazon.com. They uh, they fill the order for you, and you get a royalty check. Okay. And not only that, but then you can order what are called author's copies for yourself. You can order 15, 20, whatever you want of your own book, advertise them on your own website, and fill them that way. So you're talking about certain moments. When I got into armchair fiction, which is right there on the Sinister Cinema website, that was kind of a big moment because suddenly I had a whole new thing to do, and that was with books. And now we have over 500 books. you know, you know, where does the time go? How did I manage to get all this put together? But in the last 2 or 3 years, I have kind of rediscovered I kind of let Sinister slide a little bit. I'll be honest with you. I was so into the books. But the last 2 or 3 years, upgrading our equipment and just different video programs, different editing programs that we hadn't had before, I'm finding that I have rediscovered my love for, the video side of Sinister Cinema again. We've upgraded close to 300 of our titles, and they just look so much better than they used to. And sometimes I get people who order something, and I got to go out and upgrade that thing before I send it out to them. We have great customer service, by the way. If you buy a disc from us and 10 years goes by and you put that thing in your machine and it doesn't work, you call us on the phone, we'll send you a new one. I believe in treating our customers well, you know. So, but that's one of my bigger moments. And then, of course, Christian, there have been times over the years where I've met people. Someone calls. I was just telling somebody the other day. We sell a lot of Bela Lugosi movies. He's my favorite actor of all time. I know it should be Laurence Olivier, but it's Bela Lugosi. So one time, this is back in the 90s, back when we were still on VHS, my house phone rings, not my business phone, but my house phone rings, right? And I pick it up. I go, hello. And a voice on the other end goes, hi, is this Greg Luce from Sinister Cinema? I go, yeah. How'd you get my home line? He goes, well, this is Bela Lugosi calling. And I go, yeah, right. Who is this? Is this Mark? Is this Ed? Is this Sam? Is this Dick? Disguising your voice a little bit. No, no, this is Bela Lugosi. Okay, come on now. And then I thought it hit me. I go, Junior? He goes, yeah, Junior. And it was Bela Lugosi Jr. calling me, and I was just thrilled, to talk to the son of the man who I just admired so much.
Wow.
And so he called me. They were thinking about someone I think had approached him, and my memory may be a little rusty here, but um, someone had called him, and he called me because they wanted to come out with a line of his dad's films, and there's like 30 of Bela's old movies that are in the public domain, and he found out that I had physical 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter prints of. And they wanted to transfer them and bring out a line of Bela Lugosi's movie, newly transferred. And I think he was going to like host these or something to that effect. As my memory serves me. And we must have talked for an hour. And you know what? I never heard back from him. And as far as I
Oh,
know, the project never came to realization, not just with me, but I never saw him doing it with any other company. So something, I'm assuming something must have fallen through on his end. So, but that was a thrill. And another thrill was when I get to spend the better parts of a couple of days with Barbara Steele, who is, you would think it would be someone like Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing or Vincent Price or Lugosi or Karloff or Lon Chaney Jr. But the biggest selling horror star in the history of sinister cinema is Barbara Steele. And what a classy lady she is. I got to host a Barbara Steele retrospective at the Roxy Theater in San Francisco back in the 90s, and she was our special guest. Got to spend the whole evening with her. And then I got to go down and spend an afternoon with her and her boyfriend. We went over to Richard Harrison's house, who was another old time movie star. And so those are some of my big thrills, from the times that I've been doing sinister cinema. I mean, there's many others, but we could talk all day. As you
yeah,
can see, I,
that.
I like to talk. So,
You mentioned that you've actually sort of struggled a little bit lately, and this is something that I noticed in the show notes that was sent over to me as well. So, walk us through the business strategy that you use to overcome a sort of a declining sales period and turn things around. I know that you said that you'd updated a lot of equipment and stuff, but obviously, business strategy is something totally different. It's one thing to invest in things and make them better, but what was it that you changed?
well, I'll tell you that one of the things that I face is the fact that I hate to sound morbid, my customers are dying. We're
Right.
getting old, and it's sad. I don't have hardly, we have very few B Western fans left because they were the older fans and they've since passed on. Bless their souls. So I'm faced with declining patronage from the age groups that normally were very vast for many years. And so we've got involved, and again, with things that I should have been keeping up on. That my daughter's working with me now, and she's helping me. We're getting more involved with social media. We're getting a much bigger presence on Facebook, Instagram, um, and Twitter, and we eventually hope to launch our own channel on YouTube. That's another animal down the road because there's only so many hours in the week. And I have a marketing lady that's been helping us trying new approaches. And frankly, Christian, you are an example of what we're doing. We're trying to reach out
Yeah.
and make people aware. And so hopefully, a lot of younger people, especially people under the age of 30, they will look at some of our older films and go, oh, you know, what is this? Because, let's face it, we live in a world of CGI and totally modern technology. And these old films from the 30s, 40s, and 50s are like just ancient relics to them. But sometimes I've noticed that some of them, they find them funny or schlocky, and sometimes they make fun of them, and that's okay. I used to be a regular contributor of films to Mystery Science Theater 3000, which made fun of these movies for years. But I've noticed that every once in a while you find a younger person who, yeah, maybe they think some of this old stuff is schlocky, but yet they're touched by something. Maybe it's Christopher Lee. Maybe it's Peter Cushing. And because there are no big horror stars anymore. I don't know if you know that. Now the stars now are the effects. But we used to, when we didn't have as good effects, you had personalities. Karloff, Lugosi, Cheney Jr., Lionel Atwill, people like that. But especially when I was growing up, in the theaters at least, it was Price, Vincent Price, Peter Cushing, and the great Christopher Lee, who we lost just a few years ago. And so they find something. And so eventually some younger people are finding an interest in some of the things that we do. And that's our hope.
Definitely me. I've been a massive fan of cinema my entire life. Everything from horror movies, B horror, classic movies. Some of my favorite movies of all time have been older movies.
Mm-hmm.
Like It's a Wonderful Life. I think that is just one of the best movies ever made.
You know what
Um,
it is for me? And I just told this to a guy the other day. I think the greatest movie ever made, and I'll tell you why, is To Kill a Mockingbird.
hmm,
I know it's not a horror film. To Kill a Mockingbird, I think, is the greatest movie ever made about kids. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I've seen it many times. I don't try to watch it too often because I like to keep it fresh. Maybe once every couple of years. It's the greatest movie ever made about kids. Uh, as a horror movie fan, there are sequences in this film that are as scary as any horror film from that time period. All the scenes around Boo Radley's house and the night with the kids, and it's some terrific stuff. And the black and white photography is wonderful. It is also possibly the greatest movie ever made about racial injustice.
right.
And Atticus Finch is the father we all would love to be. It's just the greatest movie of all time, in my opinion. I almost get tears in my eyes thinking about it. You know, it's truly a classic film.
I think it largely, when it comes to classic cinema, it is all about the stories. You know what I mean? Like, and that's the thing I look out for. Like when I go back and watch like old Hitchcock movies, I mean, yeah, like if you watch like The Birds, yeah, it's kind of funny, like some of the effects with the birds and stuff, right? But it's genuinely terrifying as well. If you try and
Yeah,
just put, because I've always looked at, like I'm a big fan of professional wrestling, right? And there's a lot
I
about, right, yeah, and there's a lot about wrestling that
am.
is a bit, oh, it makes it difficult sometimes to suspend your disbelief. But that's the key, being able to suspend your disbelief. If you can
Yeah,
let certain things go and just focus on a story, that's when you lose yourself in it. And I
yeah,
felt that way when I saw um, the birds. I think that's the name of the movie, isn't it? The Birds. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And similar movies, in the 40s, 50s, 30s. There was a movie I can't remember her name, but there was a movie from like the 40s, I think. It begins with a G, and the basic storyline is like a couple that are like doing some sort of shady dealings, I think, in like
Gaslight.
Argentina. No, it's like Argentina. They're in Argentina in like some sort of casino or something. Um, oh, it's gonna drive me nuts. I don't remember this. It begins with a
So many.
G. It's a really, really famous actress, like one of the most famous of all time.
What you,
Um,
you have to remember is that as you as a younger guy, and I can
mhm.
tell you're obviously much younger than I am, uh, sometimes these old movies,
Yeah,
and this is where I encourage younger people. These older movies are it's like an acquired taste. You may be initially repulsed by them for whatever reason. You just think they're dumb or stupid. But if you take the time to watch some of them, especially some of the really good ones, if you take the time to explore some of the classic Betty Davis movies, or On the swashbuckling side, Errol Flynn. Or if you like film noir, go for Bogart or John Payne or Dan Duryea or people like that. Robert Mitchum, you'll find that eventually you may start to acquire a taste for it that you didn't have before. And the other thing to keep in mind is that part of the problem that a lot of younger people have with films of yesteryear is that because they didn't have all the technical capabilities back then, they were more dependent on script and on dialogue and on storytelling. So there's just a plethora of dialogue in a lot of these old movies that a lot of young kids, first, wow, but if you stick with it, you'll find some of the greatest movies that you thought you would never ever say were great truly are. And so, yeah, it is. It's a huge difference. And but I encourage all young people, start watching classic films. And once you start watching some of the classic ones, some of the really good ones, and you acquire the taste, that's when you can come to me. Because we have some of the not so classic movies, and we have a lot of good films too, but we do specialize in a lot of schlocky movies, which is part of the reason why they fell into the public domain to begin with, to be perfectly honest. Cheap films by cheap companies, but there's a lovable something about them, old drive-in movies. But yeah, so hopefully these films will not be forgotten. And people like me and Jack Hardy at Grapevine Video, he's my competitor, and I admire what he does very much. Hopefully we will be around long enough to help a lot of younger people discover a lot of this old stuff. And I want to say one last thing real quick. One of the reasons why I got into the book side, armchair fiction, is because books are the theater of the mind. You are not held back like cinema is, because a book is in the eyes of the reader. Okay. So even if it's written, from 1925 or 1945 or whatever, the young person who picks it up and reads it, and again, yeah, it's a literary style you might have to get used to, but you can envision it with all the CGI that you want. Okay, all the modernization that you want. It may be a period piece, but you can see it in your own modern way. And that's the wonderful thing about the book side of Sinister Cinema.
Thanks for sharing. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Let's talk more about sort of what you do with regards to film restoration and stuff like that. You experiment with, I hope I'm getting this right, the anamorphic format.
Anamorphic.
Anamorphic.
I think you're giving me too much credit. I when you say restore, I think of the guys down at UCLA going frame by frame through these old films and trying to clean them up and make a brand new, wonderful looking print out of 3 or 4 old beat up negatives or old 35 theatrical prints even sometimes that they try to put together and scientifically restore and create a new vibrant, they just did that with Invaders from Mars, and I hear it looks beautiful. They did it with White Zombie with Lugosi from 1932, and that looks beautiful. Now here at Sinister, what we do is basically try to get a good copy of a movie onto disc. Now, I will say that in the days when I was transferring film, and I haven't been doing it for a few years now, we would take old beat up prints, and when we transfer them to video, we had a device called a wet gate device, which was this little reservoir of the stuff called pick clear solution, which when you transferred the film, it went through, right before it went through the aperture plate, it was immersed on either side of the film with this pick clear solution, which had this magic capability of, as the light, it was a refractionary process. When the light hit the print, and you could have all these black lines in the print, it could be just a chewed print. There's some type of, the fluid would fill for just a few moments, would fill those cracks, and there was this refractionary process that I don't understand as the film went through the aperture plate and projected into your camera, which was transferring it into a video signal, it looked like literally a brand new print. And that is how we restored things for our customers. And the other thing about anamorphic that you mentioned is that starting back in the early 50s, we went to widescreen.
Mhm.
Okay, there was a widescreen 16 by 9. There was CinemaScope, but even films that weren't shot in CinemaScope were composed for widescreen. So there's 4 by 3, which is your old full screen, and then there's 16 by 9, which is your widescreen. And there's various formats within those. Okay, there's all these different numbers I don't want to confuse your listeners with. But at any rate, most older films, especially in America from about 53 or 54 on forward, 1953 or 1954 on forward, even though we saw them full screen on television or full screen even in the movie theaters, they were composed for widescreen. So when the guys were looking through the cameras, filming the movie, that on many of the cameras, as I understand it, I've never actually viewed one of these, but as I understand it from my readings, there was like this area, like dotted lines. So you'd have this for the full screen area, and then there were dotted lines, and that was the widescreen area. Okay, and
Okay.
that's where they composed the main parts. The meat of the film was composed between those two lines. So now you can go back if you have a full screen edition of something, you can actually, and you can always tell by looking at the opening credits. If the opening credits have a lot of space at the top and the bottom, it's composed, 99% of the time, it's composed for widescreen. You can literally pull that widescreen image out, put it onto video, and bring it out in the widescreen format as it was composed for originally anyway. And, we just did this with Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, not
What
exactly
a
what
film name.
yeah, I know, one of the all-time greats. It had never been available in widescreen. We did it with Attack of the Giant Leeches recently. We're doing it with the Amphibian Man. So in that sense, we're doing some restoration, I guess, if you want to call it that. But as far as real restoration goes, that's that's for the boys at the Eastman House or down at UCLA or some of these other big film archives. And bless their heart for the job they do. And sometimes our funds are lacking, so we get what we can get from them, and we should cherish it. So, but anyway, that's my take on restoration.
One fun aspect to this as well is like, particularly if you have like an old, let's say they filmed two versions or something like that, and there was a widescreen version, but for whatever reason they weren't able to put that out or something like that. When you get these widescreen versions, you can sometimes see like mistakes, like maybe the sound guy is too far into the picture or something like that.
Well,
Or
I think you've got it backward, Christian. What it is the widescreen version. You'll see more mistakes in the full screen version. For instance, you'll see we've got this. What's this movie? It's a Robert Clark movie, Hollywood Confidential, or not Hollywood something. It's a little exploitation film from the early '60s, and it was composed for widescreen, but it was shot in full screen as well at the same time simultaneously, and you can see microphones hanging down and all this stuff. I mean, I've seen more mics hanging down in that specific movie than any movie I've ever seen before. So yeah, and I'll tell you a couple of funny stories real quick. Some of these old movies from the '30s, we sell a lot of old B westerns. Well, we don't sell that many anymore, but we've got hundreds available. But some of these films were so cheaply made. Um, that, for instance, there's a movie called Lightning Range. It's made in 1934, I think. It's a Superior Talking Pictures production, which was anything but what they were. They were the cheapest movies ever made, and they the name of the title of the film and the opening credits is misspelled.
oh,
Instead of saying Lightning Range, it says Lighting Range. And you can see all kinds of mistakes that because they were so cheap, they just didn't bother to correct. I've seen even things in big movies where they made mistakes and left them in.
Oh,
So
that grinds my gears so much. I can
yeah,
let it
yeah,
go when it's a small production. If any, like me and my dad like to watch bad budget horror movies for fun.
yeah,
Like it's a
oh
bit
yeah.
sadistic. I know it's a bit sadistic, but I just find it fun, hilarious. Like I don't. I remember years ago watching one bad horror movie that had like zero budget, and it was so easy to figure out who the killer was. It was basically just like a band in a studio years afterwards doing I don't know, like a reunion record or whatever, and the guy who was the killer like came in with a really bad attitude, and then suddenly 2 minutes later he's acting like really really aggressive, and it's like, well, it's obviously this guy, come on. And then when they did the big reveal, it's like, oh wow,
Yeah.
never saw that coming. But it was funny. I don't know, it was good, like
The nice thing about being a movie aficionado, and even just if you're just an old movie aficionado, they made so many of them that we can never see them all in our lifetime.
yeah.
I will, I'll live to be maybe 90 or 95, hopefully, healthy, hopefully, and I will still have plenty of old movies to watch because they made so many of them that you literally, unless you're watching them 24 hours a day,
Oof.
you just can't see them all in your lifetime. There's too many hours.
One thing
So,
about that as well that I think that fact right there makes ratings and reviews so much more important. But you take a gamble. See, that's the thing. Like with a modern movie, let's say it's critically acclaimed. Sometimes you go and see that movie and it's terrible. But then the flip is true. Sometimes a movie gets critically panned and it's amazing. So you really take a gamble every time if you rely on the critics and the reviews.
oh, it's true.
I,
The
I
latest
tend to
Academy
discard what
Awards are
friends
a
say.
prime example of that.
Ah,
I mean, um, I didn't see the show, but I know that what was the movie that won everything
that
all at
movie was
once?
good. I'll
No,
say
it
that.
was.
I saw
And
that in the cinema. That was good.
I saw it in the theater.
Yeah.
But if you had told me, well, let me put it to you this way: Top Gun Maverick,
Right.
which took us back to the 1980s again. I mean, it was the kind of action film that we hadn't seen in many, many years. Steven Spielberg, I believe, said recently that Tom Cruise saved Hollywood last year.
Ugh.
I'll tell you, that movie probably for every one person that saw and enjoyed the film that won Best Picture, there were probably 20 people who saw and enjoyed perhaps even more Top Gun Maverick
Mm.
because it was just much more mass appeal than the other film. The other film was a great film. It was well made, but it's not a movie that you're going to watch more than once or twice or maybe three times over a long period of time. But Top Gun Maverick, people were going back to see that in the theaters over and over and over again because it had that mass appeal element and it was extremely well done.
That's a really good point as well. Because I'm not sure I agree with your point on that movie. I thought it was particularly sensational, but I do 100% agree with you that a big part of what makes a film great is replayability.
Yep.
Like I remember hearing one time someone refer to a movie as being like a weekend blockbuster, which was a term back in the day. I don't know if they still use this, but what that kind of implies is that, yeah, for one weekend, it was the talk of the town, and now no one cares. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because you still see that sometimes. You'll see everyone go on about something like, yeah, you got to see this, got to see this, and you see it, and it's great, and then you never come back to it again. But then
That's
there are
right.
movies and TV shows that you continuously binge watch all the time because they're so well written, and it's like I don't know, like what necessarily are the components that make something replayable and enjoyable over time. I guess part of it is up to the individual viewer. Part of it is just connecting in a way that makes it timeless. You
Yeah.
know, like an example that comes to my mind right now is the TV show How I Met Your Mother. I think the reason why it's got this kind of long-term appeal is that it doesn't, it's not some, it's not a series that's rooted in its time period. Like there'll be things in there, references in there, jokes in there that you really needed to appreciate at the time, and so when you watch it years later it becomes kind of outdated, but the principal kind of lessons of it, or the fundamentals of it, remain the same, and they remain enjoyable over time. And I think that's especially true with like good horror movies and classic cinema. Go back to what we were talking about earlier with like good dialogue. My biggest criticism with old cinema has nothing to do with production. My biggest criticism is more the acting. Sometimes I actually feel in certain productions they were too much like theater acting, because they were still figuring it out. Do you know what I mean? There was, and that's an important point, because theater acting and on-screen acting, very different things. And that kind of goes into the whole believability aspect of things and being able to suspend your disbelief, you know?
Well, you're right to a degree, but you have to remember that the literally the style of language in America back in
Mm-hmm.
the 1930s and the 1940s was very, very different.
Oh, 100%.
And so, you know,
But
in some films, I see your point. Like if you take a big spectacle film with like Elizabeth in Essex, it's filled with British actors and actresses, or the Errol Flynn's an Australian, you know, and they are doing it like a Shakespearean play in a way, in
yeah,
a way. But yet, if you take a movie like The Big Sleep with Bogart, or The Maltese Falcon with Bogart, this is more of a whole New York thing. That gumshoe downtown gritty, Manhattan feel to it, and or the Bronx or wherever. And so those guys were they were not that dissimilar to the people on the streets of New York or Los Angeles during those days. So when we look at it now, it seems different, or maybe not real, not as real, but it was closer to real than maybe you think, because of the time period that it was made. And I think that if you had lunch with Edward G. Robinson, he would be talking to you in his normal voice, and you'd be thinking you're part of his movie, because that's the way he was. So it wasn't so much that they were.
so what you're saying is, back in the day, life was more like movies.
It's
Yeah, I know what
it's
you mean. I know what you
no,
mean.
in some ways, I guess. But
I get it.
if you want to really explore some great acting, just go back and look at the movies of Betty Davis or Katharine Hepburn, particularly
Completely agree.
Davis.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, you look at her in Now Voyager, and then you look at her in The Little Foxes, or in Jezebel, or all the, and then later what happened to Baby Jane. This woman could act. The same thing with Hepburn. The only person I can think of really off the top of my, and I'm not trying to slight anybody modern. Dame Judy's wonderful. Meryl Streep is wonderful. But these ladies back from that time period had acting chops, the likes of which I've never seen.
Mm.
I mean, and that doesn't apply to all of them. A lot of them were just great presences on screen, smooth actresses who did a great job, But there's some of those ladies, and Davis is the one that to me stands like a beacon. Uh, that woman could act. I mean, you just need to, if you haven't explored her works, I say go start around 1935, watch Dangerous, and then work your way up right through the 1940s. And a lot of them are soap operas and things like that. But I mean, there's some really fine work there by a consummate actress who hopefully will never be forgotten.
I'd like to talk a little bit now about your experiences as a DJ. You mentioned at the top of the show that you
Oh
were
yeah.
a DJ on the radio. So, what was the
Yeah,
craziest or the most unexpected moment you had as a DJ?
there are many.
Haha.
I started in little small markets. I was a top 40 DJ. Changed my name numerous times over the years from what station to station. And we were live back then. You a lot of stuff today, there isn't that much live radio anymore. It's all recorded and stuff like that. Radio's really changed, at least in America. I don't know about Great Britain, the UK.
But
Um,
it really depends. We do have a lot
it-
of live radio, but I know exactly what you mean. Like
yeah,
now there's this kind of blur between
yeah, and especially on music shows.
podcasts and
Yeah,
yeah.
but we used to go on the air live, and I have 3 minutes. When I was at KMEL, which was the last station I worked for, that was in San Francisco. We were a big station. Yeah, Howard and I, he was a guy I worked with. He did afternoons, I did evenings. I remember when we interviewed Duran Duran. John and Andy Taylor came in, and it was a madhouse. I mean, the building, we were right sitting next to Pier 39, right there at San Francisco Bay. And our building was surrounded by hundreds of screaming girls, and I remember they had a dummy limousine come in right up to the door and go into the back parking lot around to the back of the building. And this throng of girls chased this dummy limo, and the real limo came up and unloaded John and Andy right by the service access door on the side. But I remember um, Andy got out of the car, and John, who was taller, got out of the car. And obviously, there was a couple of girls who had gone through this before, and they knew the routine, and they knew that that first limo was a dummy. And suddenly, I see this teenage girl, the body of a teenage girl, fly up and grapple John
Oh my
Taylor and
God.
kiss him right on the mouth. And he peels her off, and we get him inside, slam the door, and it's locked. And we hear this thump, 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 thump. And we got him up on the air. Now getting him back into their limo, that was another thing altogether. That was, the whole Beatles thing. And in fact, during the years that I was in radio, from the late 70s right into the late 80s, about 10 years, I think Duran Duran, I'm not saying that they were the best selling group of all time, but they certainly had more hysteria in terms of the fans surrounding them. I mean, everywhere they went, it was like 1964 and the Beatles all over again. And so that was quite a moment. And I'll never forget, after John and Andy left, okay, the girls surrounded the building. They were still there 2 hours later. Finally, my GM, my general manager, says, Sonny Joe, my name was Sonny Joe Fox back. They gave me that name, by the way. That was the name that I had picked up. I was Sonny Joe Fox, Cameo. Anyway, he said, go down and sign some autographs. Okay. And so I went down to the back parking lot, and I'm standing there, and I was very popular. I had high ratings, and the girls, oh, Sonny Joe, you got to talk to John and Andy. So I'm signing all these autographs. And the mistake I made was I said, yeah, girls, yeah. And here is the hand who shook hands with John Taylor. They rushed me through. They were pulling at my hand, and I'm going, no. And for a second there, it was like a mob.
Mad.
And that's one story. Now, another story was when we had the Beastie Boys on.
Oh,
The,
I know you're talking,
the,
man.
the, the Beastie Boys had a reputation and I think this was part of their shtick. And I'm not trying to, if they're listening, I'm not trying to step on their feelings here or cause any problems. But when they came to KMEL, they came into the studio, and we were warned ahead of time that they might do weird stuff on the air because they could at times be very disrespectful, rude, that
Oh,
type of
wow.
thing. So I got them into the studio. We had them all mic'd up, and it went fairly well. They were a little curt at times, but finally, after about, I don't know, I interviewed them for like 45 minutes or so. Finally, I tried to wrap up the interview, right? So, and they said, what? You don't want us anymore? Well, we're not leaving. you know? And so I'd go into a record, and I'd come back, and they'd still be there. And I go, well, guys, I want to thank you again for being here. Hey, man, you trying to get rid of us? We're not going. We're staying right here. And finally, they wouldn't leave the studio. So finally, what I had to do is I just started segueing record to record to record to record and not saying anything in between the records. And finally,
Oh,
their manager said, okay, guys, let's go. And they got up and they left, you know? And so, yeah, that was quite an experience.
that's
Um,
so weird. Like,
yeah,
I just for a second, like normally the story you hear is that the artists don't want to be in the interview and you're desperately trying to keep them in the room and stuff. Like I can't imagine a scenario where they're like, "Oh no, we want to be here. We want to stay. We want to sleep over and take your job." I don't know.
Yeah, I remember the time Debbie Gibson came, and she became a big superstar when she was what, 16, 17 years old. I mean, and I don't even know if you know who Debbie Gibson is, but she was huge during the 1980s.
Okay.
And she was a young star. And the remarkable thing about her, she was like 16, 17, 18 years old. She was writing all of her own music and
Mad.
recording it. And I'll never forget, she had top 5 records and stuff like that. We brought her into the studio and I interviewed her on the air. She was one of the sweetest people I ever met. And I'll never forget, her mother came in with her because her mother, she was like 16 or 17 years old. Her mother went everywhere with her, escorted her everywhere,
That's
and
good.
they were just the nicest people. And then Fine Young Cannibals, they came in. The two main guys, the lead singer and one of the top, one of the founders of the group, I guess. I can't remember their names. And they had that great hit record, Good Thing, and plus a number of other things. And I'll never forget, I had them mic'd up there sitting, and I'm at my control console, I'm talking just like you are into your mic, right? And they're in front of me on either side talking into their mics. And suddenly the lead singer just gets up and walks across to the corner of the room and sits down in a chair over there. And I'm going, not back. I'm trying to signal them without, because you can't see me because I'm on radio. I'm going,
Right.
you know? And so I just continued with the other guy for like 10, 15 minutes. And finally, the other guy's like, okay, I'm ready to come back. And he comes back and he sits down and I start talking to him again, but those are some of the celebrity stories I have. I could go on and on about all kinds of funny other stuff.
I was gonna say, did you get like regular callers call in? Anything that kind of like was difficult
Oh
to
God.
manage or something?
I tell you, Justin, if you really want to find out about KMEL, there's a website called KMEL Forever. A good friend of mine, Keith Smith, he keeps it up. And I think it's still on the internet. If you go on to KMEL Forever, you can go on. First of all, you can see me on the air. Go down and look for Sonny Joe Fox in the video gallery. There's about a 2 or 3 minute thing of me doing my show. It's like a blast from the past. And but there's also the audio gallery, and they have little interviews, little short things like 2, 3, 4 minutes long about certain things that happened at the station. And if you go into the audio gallery and look under Sonny Joe Fox, you find all these little things with me talking about the very stuff that you're talking about. And people calling. There was this one lady, I'll tell this real quick. There was this one lady who called, and I had seen her at a station function one time. She was actually an older lady, probably in her late 20s, and I was about, I don't know, 32, something like that. Sonny Joe, rocking the hits every night. Anyway, she started calling me on the air, on the request line on a regular basis. And finally, one day she goes, I think I've decided that you and I should go out, or something to that effect. And I was married. And so finally she said, I'm going to come down to the station. I'm going to come in there and I'm going to have my way with you.
Oh my God.
And yeah, and I said, do not do that. Do not come down to the station. You cannot come in here. First of all, I wasn't worried about it because the door was locked, and I was the evening jock. So, I didn't think much of it. I got off the phone with her, and our program director, a guy by the name of Steve Rivers, was in. He eventually went to Kiss FM in Los Angeles. Great guy. Anyway, he came into the studio. He was doing some work in his office. He was working late, as most program directors were prone to do back then. But I said, now look, I just had this call, Steve, from a lady. If somehow she gets into the building and you see this lady in skimpy clothing walking around like she wants to seduce every guy in the station, it's not my fault, okay? And so anyway, it's like maybe 45 minutes later, and I don't know how she did it, but in the studio, there was another studio next to it, and another studio next to it on the other side of that, and there were glass windows between each one. So the very next studio next to the main control room was where the news guys worked. So in the morning when you're on the air, you cue the news guy and all that, and then there was a production studio. So all of a sudden, I'm about, I don't know, it's maybe 45 minutes to an hour later. I look up in the newsroom and here's this lady. I'm going, oh, how did you get in here? And she's standing there with her hands on her hips, looking at me like, I'm here for you, you know? And so I saw Rivers in the production studio in the next studio over. So I had this little intercom. So without really looking at her, I looked down and I go, Steve, you know that lady I told you about? He goes, yeah. I go, well, she's in the newsroom looking at me right now. And he looks up and he sees her. So, she got taken out and kicked out of the building. But, things like that would happen on a regular basis. I remember when I hosted the Wham, were they still Wham UK? Yeah, it was George Michael and Andrew Ridgely. I hosted the Wham Day on the Green at the Oakland Coliseum. There's like 40,000 screaming teenage girls all screaming to uh, uh, get after George Michael or Andrew Ridgely. Anyway, after KMEL we had our own bus, right? And so I hosted it that day. We had the Pointer Sisters and Katrina and the Waves. I got to interview Katrina. She was real nice. I'm walking on sunshine. Anyway,
On that record. Great
yeah,
record.
yeah, she was real nice. I think it was their only hit. But so the concert's over and people are screaming out, and my wife and I are in the KMEL bus. Well, Rivers, my boss, had told me over the years, you can be married all you want. I don't care, but just don't talk about it on the air. Sonny Joe Fox, in the eyes of his listeners, is a single man. That's what we want. That's the image we want. So I couldn't tell people on the air that I was married. I had to be single Sonny Joe, right? So we're in the bus, the KMEL bus. And this is after the Wham Day on the Green, and it's dark outside. And these girls, they see me through the window, one of the bus windows. They see me and they come up and they go, Sonny Joe, hi, So I open the window. I tell my wife, Lisa, go to the back. They can't see you. And so they're all there. And all of a sudden, there's this huge crowd of kids talking to me and wanting me to sign autographs and all this stuff. And the funny part about this story is, do you remember? I don't know how well you know the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five and all that stuff, but there used to be this song that they would sing to the Beatles all the time. It goes, "We love you, Beatles. Oh, yes, we do. We don't love anyone as much as you." And it went on and on and on, right? So these girls started singing this stupid song to me. We love you, Sonny. And so my wife is in the back of the bus throwing up. So but radio is filled with these fun little moments. And it was like being paid to play. And I did it for 10 years. And I don't really miss it because I never really look back at it, but I look back at it fondly. It was a great period in my life.
I was
And
gonna say
I hosted television shows too, but you know,
it must feel like living multiple different lives. I think that's the thing that fascinates me because I've lived a fair bit already, and I can certainly say that like when you delve back into those times, it feels and looks different, and you look back on that person like that was me once. That's not me anymore, but it's like that was then. This is now, kind of thing, and it's interesting
oh
reflecting
yeah.
back.
Well, I look at myself in the mirror right now, and then I go back and look at that Sonny Joe Fox clip I was telling you about. It's like, who is that guy? I know exactly what you mean. Where does the time go? Where does the time go?
Got any stories from your times presenting TV? I mean, I'm intrigued.
Well, like I said, I don't know if you know much about the Winchester Mystery House, um, but I was shooting at my Sinister Cinema TV show, and this is one of the things. Usually, with these weekend horror movie shows that you'd have in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, you'd have a local guy dress up in fangs and a cape and all that stuff. Well, again, my boss Rivers, he says you can't do that. You got to be if you're going to do this show, you got to do it as Sonny Joe Fox, because he didn't want his popular teenage night jock to be dressed up in with a cape on and fangs and weird makeup and all this stuff.
No, really?
Yeah, so I had to be Sonny Joe. So I would go down, and I'll never forget. Uh, we the Winchester Mystery House. I don't know if you know much about the story, but I think her name was Margaret Winchester. She was like the widow of, I can't remember his first name, but the guy who developed the Winchester rifle.
Oh,
Okay,
wow.
yeah, and the Winchester rifle was instrumental, I guess, in the Indian Wars in the 1800s, and thousands and thousands of Indians died from bullets from the Winchester rifles that were issued to the military. Okay,
Right.
so she had found out, I guess, Mrs. Winchester, and she was very rich because they developed that rifle and made a lot of money selling it to the government, I guess, the military. But she had been cursed by Indian tribes. Um, and I can't remember all the exactitudes of the story, but basically, she kept building on to this house. It's huge, day and night for many years, construction, because somehow all the noise at night and the construction that was going on would kind of keep at bay the evil Indian spirits that she knew were coming after her. So that's why this house, some parts of the house don't make any sense. For instance, we shot one of our shows. You open this door, right? And there's a stairwell. Well, the stairwell leads nowhere. There's a ceiling that goes straight across and the stairwell ends. That's just an example. Rooms that went out and then you have a door. You walk out the door and you fall 2 stories, you know? So we shot all these shows there, and I would come down there every week. They'd tell me what movies. Actually, it got to where I was programming because I knew the horror movies better than they did, and because my knowledge of it. And so I remember we'd go in there. They would get the cameras. We'd have my director, and they'd look at me and they'd point the camera. Okay, we're doing Dead Men Walk and The Monster Maker this weekend. So Dead Men Walk is the first movie. Okay, do your intro, and then you've got 90 seconds to talk about the movie. And they point their finger and they say, go. And if you've learned anything about me in this last hour that we've been doing this interview, you know that I am not at a loss for words. And because I was in radio, I had this clock in my head. When you're doing radio, you have like this record has a 30-second intro. This one has a 15-second intro before they start singing that you can talk up before you don't want to hit the vocals. So DJs develop this timer in their head. And so they'd say, okay, you got 90 seconds. Okay, blah, 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 boom. And, that's how we did it. And I do 5 shows in one weekend, 4 shows sometimes. And it went very smooth. We bring people down. I will tell you one time we had on a witch. She was local from the Bay Area. I interviewed her, and she was a white witch, white magic. Okay. And we got into talking about white witchcraft, as it was called at the time, or white magic. And she got on the subject of, have you ever heard of Anton LaVey?
Yes.
Anton LaVey was like the head of was it the Satanic
Satanic
Church?
Church? Yeah.
Something like that, the Church of Satan or something. And he was in the Bay Area. And this is back in the 60s and the 70s. Anyway, I don't even know he's still alive. She started talking about him, and she did not talk about him in very complimentary tones, because she didn't think too much of black magic. So we ran the show, and the following day, the station gets a phone call. Anton LaVey wants to come on my show and have his chance to challenge what this woman had said. And I'm going, this guy is, and I don't know, maybe he's just in some ways just a normal guy, but you hear all this stuff about Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, and we got really kind of scared, and we just didn't return his phone calls. And you know what? They called a couple times, and then they stopped calling. We thought, whew, dodged a bullet on that one. So that's one of my interesting TV stories.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
A couple of quick fire questions for you now. What's the best advice you've ever received?
Believe it or not, sometimes the best advice you ever get is from movies. And I'll tell you, I just quoted this to my granddaughter the other day. You remember that scene in A League of Their Own where, is it A League of Their Own? But anyways, Tom Hanks talking to someone and he says, someone is complaining that it's too hard, one of his players or something like that. And he looks at him and he says, the hard is what makes it great. If it was easy, everyone can do it. You know, the hard is what makes it great. Don't, in essence, don't be afraid if something is hard. Grapple it, take it by the horns, and work hard at it. And one of the other lessons I've always learned is to treat people well. And, it's like if you treat people well, if you are honest with them, and I'm not perfect, I have my moments where I've done things that I regret. We all do. But I try to go through life treating people well. And if you treat them well, generally speaking, they will treat you well back, you know. And, that's some advice I guess I'm giving. But I always like that one in the movie. And I hope I've got the movie right. I believe it was A League of Their Own. The hard is what makes it great. And another time, I came out of, and this is many, many years ago before I started Sinister Cinema. As a DJ, I wasn't necessarily struggling, but I was in the medium markets. I was working in the Fresno market, which is not a major market, and you could be fairly successful. You had something to, you had accomplished to get to a medium market like Fresno, California. That was, a bit of an accomplishment, but it's still not like working at KFRC in San Francisco or KHJ in Los Angeles, right? So I remember I went to see the movie Reds with Warren Beatty, which is all about the early days of the Communist Revolution and all this stuff. It was a 3-hour movie. It had Warren Beatty, Jack Nicholson, Diane Keaton, and a host of other people. It's one of the greatest movies I had ever seen. That movie, even though it had nothing to do with radio, I remember getting out of that movie. I was so inspired by Beatty's filmmaking. And I remember I drove out to this point where I could see all these different radio towers. And I was looking at them and I was saying to myself, you've got it in you to do the kind of quality work that you just saw on the screen. And I did. I really worked hard and I made my way up through radio and TV. And when I left on my own terms, and I never looked back. Here I am, dubbing movies, 39 years later, but still loving it.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
What's the biggest life lesson you've learned so far?
Wow. Boy, that's a good one. Give me about 30 minutes. I'll come back. Biggest life lesson. Well, part of it is about, like I said, treat people well. I'm more of a traditional guy. I believe in supporting family and friends, and try to be there for people. I look, I'm a capitalist. I don't mind making money, but I believe in doing good things for people. Whether it be contributing and sponsoring a softball team in my softball league, or helping someone out who's down, or I had a guy who's working for me for years. I gave him money to do stuff for me all the time and sometimes I just go over and give him money because he was destitute. And I knew that, he was doing his best, but some people just need an extra hand, you know? And so you try to give people an extra hand once in a while, your kids, whatever it is. And sometimes they try I got 5 of them,
Damn.
sometimes, yeah, yeah. But they're all pretty good kids. And so, yeah, life lessons. I learned real young from my upbringing in Walla Walla, Washington and Pendleton, Oregon, traditional standard common, I want to say common sense morality of treating people well, not cheating, not stealing, try not to lie. We all lie once in a while, but try not to, and that was really ingrained into me by my mother.
Hmm.
My dad had been a serviceman during World War II, and so he had multiple sclerosis, and he was in the VA hospital in Walla Walla the last few years of his life. So it was just mom raising my brother and I, and she, in her own latent way, pounded those types of values into my brother and I. And we've kept them ever since. And frankly, the media back then, we lived by the Hays Code and all that in our movies, and TV was just as strict. You portrayed virtue far more back in those days than you do now. And that it was important to be virtuous. And, the good guys always won, the bad guys always lost. And that was the way it was supposed to be. You knew what the good guys were, in spite of all the stuff you hear about how bad America used to be. No, we had our problems, especially if you're a black person living in the South. I don't debate that for a moment. But there was a true goodness in our culture back then, and I got to live through that. Those were wonderful times. They truly were. And it's not like my parents were rich. We worked and scraped for everything we had. And when I got out of college, and thank God college didn't cost that much back then, I've worked my rear off to do what I've done. So those are some of my life lessons.
Thank you very much for sharing and for being on the show. It's been a real pleasure. Do you have any upcoming projects or maybe some final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Um, as in Bob Wilkins, when he had his show Creature Features on Channel 2 from San Francisco all those years ago. God, I love Bob Wilkins. I got to interview him. In fact, we sell an interview with me and Bob Wilkins on one of our discs. I can't. It's coupled up with uh, what is it? A Christopher Lee short and this other thing. I'm getting old. Can't remember. I think it's Solitaire, maybe. Anyway, so he used to do his show from a rocking chair. Okay. And he'd smoke a cigar. And he was, in a sense, he never dressed in fangs or anything. He had glasses on, this little Weasley kind of guy. And he had this big chalkboard thing that said, watch horror films, keep America strong. And that's
What badass.
that's kind of my closing message, I guess.
Love it. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, man.
All right, man. I appreciate it. It's been a great time. You want to do it again sometime? We can do it.
I would absolutely love that. And thank you very much to the listeners of the Christian Reeve podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this show as much as I have. And be safe, be well. I'll see you in the next one.